Since we all can't be at the conference in person, we'd like to have a panel discussion where we're all here discussing some topics that we thought would be interesting for everyone here to hear. So Ilka, I know you've got a question to start off with. Let's start with you.
Sure. So most of my work is actually related to single family homes. And I always feel like passive house certification, in particular Phius certification, works really well with single family homes. But it doesn't address everything that I want to address all the time. So I'm kind of wondering what certification does actually work really well on a single family home, together with energy goals. So I'm kind of wondering if well is the one that we should be looking at. Christy.
Sure. Yeah, so single family homes, well is not necessarily like fully geared towards it. It's more towards like multifamily homes. But I think you could certainly take a lot of the concepts from there when you're considering, like, you know, where you're going to be building or purchasing your home in relation to its site. Like, are you in a walkable community, that kind of thing? Or do you have access to a park if you don't have, you know, a yard that's big enough, or something like that. And also taking the same concepts because, again, like you're managing your own household. You're not doing it, you know, you're not managing a whole bunch of people, but like, you know, the same concepts when it comes to your own eating choices and like for the nourishment concept. And there's a whole bunch of other things like that, but just a matter, those are some examples. So I don't know, is there any other rating systems that might be applicable that we've talked about today towards single family homes?
You know that living building challenge is quite arduous. And so we were just thinking maybe, you know, using some of the concepts and kind of infuse passive house with those ideas, I think could really bring us probably to the next level. Kelly, I know you said previously in a discussion that we had how arduous the material pedal is in terms of certification. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the material pedal is a very, as you said, arduous process to achieve. The vetting that is required for every material going in to the building is quite extensive. And so justifying doing that on a smaller project can be maybe a challenge. However, you could say, well, it's less materials go into that building, so maybe that would be worth it. I do wonder too, like, what value does that certification have to a single family home owner, right? Unlike a business or a larger project that's trying to showcase or market themselves as something, you know, having the plaque on the wall is not necessarily as valuable to a single family homeowner. But that doesn't mean that they don't care about the things that we're all talking about. So it's a tough balance to strike, but I think Living Building Challenge is definitely set up to address all of the things that, you know, all of the topics that are addressed in a single family home design. So I think and because of the scale, it can be easier to achieve from things from the standpoint of like water and energy. So on one hand, the materials makes it not make sense, but I would say for energy and water, it does make sense. So I don't know, that's a tricky one to answer, but I think with the right client that's ready to go through that process with you, it would be the right certification.
And also looking at, you know, certain materials, maybe just making some educated guesses and choices in terms of what kind of materials should be on a project. I think, you know, just like that kind of guideline or thinking or background information, I think could guide to a better passive house in terms of like maybe trying to reach for foam-free insulation everywhere, different materials, maybe pushing for different materials that otherwise aren't as used at the moment, and maybe just guiding the path to, you know, just better, healthier materials in general.
Sure.
And in addition, embodied carbon considerations, of course.
Right.
So how about LEED? How does that fit in there? Like once we look towards LBC, would LEED add anything to the whole picture, or is that something that's kind of stepping back a little bit from those other certifications?
I mean, I would say that LEED is definitely not as aggressive as LBC, and doesn't require you to do as many things as LBC. But LEED v4 is definitely moving in the right direction as far as pushing for healthy materials and things like that. So it could be a nice supplement that doesn't quite get you the full LBC, but would work well with enhancing a PHIUS certification, because PHIUS will focus on the energy and performance, and LEED then helps bring you in things that consider site and context and things like that, where PHIUS really doesn't have anything that does that. So it could be a nice harmony there.
Absolutely. I mean, there's like this very specific LEED for home, which would be more for single family home type things, which is more geared towards that. But there's also LEED core, which is like, there's LEED, like there's like a LEED platinum project, and then there's like LBC. But it's kind of like somewhere in between, where the strategies are not quite as stringent as LBC, but they're certainly a stretch above LEED, which could potentially be more appropriate for a residential setting than a full LBC. You're taking the same concepts, just not dialing up quite so much.
Right.
So, I mean, I know, Sangeeta, you have looked more at PHIUS versus the international standards. So how is your outlook on that, and especially looking potentially at just single family houses?
Yeah, so my experience has been all multifamily, and they've been targeting passive house standards, and most of them actually are going in for Passive House International. However, my take would be, I definitely like the idea that Passive House is very stringent and targets like a lower operational carbon and very good with energy efficiency. It'll be nice to be able to take it to the next level, to kind of include embodied carbon in the materials, and also another level of conceptually getting in some of the living building challenge, and including a building standard as well, even if we don't formally target, because we all know like all these standards are expensive and intense, but for the overall benefit of human health and environmental health, I think bringing in like big concepts is really helpful. In our experience, when we were like analyzing the same building for international passive house standards versus PHIUS, we did, looking at the multi-phase project we did, where we are looking at designing phase 5, which is going into tax credits this end of this year. We've been struggling quite a bit to do like an all electric building. With the Passive House International standard, we are not able to comply with the primary energy threshold with like tanks. These are tanked 40-gallon electric hot water heaters. So we are trying to test heat pump hot water heaters and hoping we can comply with either the PHIUS Core 2021 or Passive House International standards for phase 5. The analysis is yet out there. We don't have the end result yet. And we are hoping for the best, because we as the design team and the client is very interested to do all electric buildings. So hoping the standards work to our favor if we can get the heat pump hot water heaters to work.
And in your case, you definitely have to fulfill the certification criteria, because you need their certification, right? You can't make the decision that I can make, where I can say, okay, my priority is actually a little bit different than what the certification standard is asking for, and the client is okay with not getting that plaque. But for you, it's a financial decision, right?
Right, because these are all affordable housing projects driven by the LIHTC, which is the low income housing tax credit application process. So yes, at the end of the day, a formal final certification is a required documentation with which the financing agency wants. So yes, so we don't have a choice. We have to do the certification we are committing to as part of the tax credit application. So definitely that's a yes, but sometimes I feel like depending, and I think also it depends on the type of building. These buildings are all like 3 stories and the volumes are smaller. So we're having the struggle to get the primary energy and source energy criteria to pass. But perhaps in a larger building, we are doing a few mid-rise passive houses as well, but we haven't tested the hot water heater is like an offer to be an all electric building. Maybe it could be, I'm assuming it's much easier because you have a good buffer there. But yes, to answer your question, Ilka, the end result is yes, a final certification is needed.
So it's really all about goals, right? And I know, Kelly, for yours, you had different really, really high level goals for your project specifically. So how did you decide which goals are the most important, or like how did you prioritize?
So fortunately for me, we had a wonderful client in the Harris School of Public Policy at University of Chicago, where as a public policy school, they really wanted to be a champion in really anything that they produce at that school. And so when we were weighing all the certification systems with them and kind of what they mean and what they actually do, they really latched on to the idea of Living Building Challenge because you have to prove out a lot of what you're doing, not just with the vetting for the materials, but also you do like a post-occupancy survey to make sure that the building is doing what you said it was going to do. And so they really grabbed onto the idea of data and, proving that you're doing what you say you're going to do. So as well as it was going to be a first in the region. So they wanted to be a leader. And so when you have a client who cares about those things, it's kind of easy to sell them to do the most aggressive or most advanced option. We also convinced them that LEED wasn't before, it was the 2009 version, was a good supplement to the Living Building Challenge because we weren't going to be able to do the full certification. We were only going to get pedal because we had a lot of limitations on our area for energy. We weren't going to get there to be net zero, and water is really not an option in Chicago given the current plumbing codes. And so to supplement the things that we weren't going to be able to do for the full Living Building Challenge, we brought in LEED to kind of bring up the rest of those kind of categories. So it was a nice synergy of those two certifications, but a lot of it had to do with them wanting to be the first and kind of pioneering for that education sector, both at the university as well as within public policy schools.
So did you?
Sorry, go ahead, Ilka.
I was just wondering if you had different consultants for LEED and for LBC. Like how do you actually pair, the certifications together in terms of woman power behind it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we did have different consultants for pieces of those certifications outside of kind of your normal consultant team that all had certainly their piece of the documentation. But we did have an outside firm, a woman-owned business, actually, AP Monarch, that was kind of in charge of managing the whole documentation process across both LEED and LBC. And then we had another consultant, YR&G at the time, which later became WSP, that just assisted in the vetting of the materials process. So, part of that splitting up was just because it was that big of an animal to tackle. But it was good to involve more firms in the process because it helped everybody kind of elevate their game and sustainability and work on this type of project. But it was a huge undertaking that required outside help for sure.
Yeah, and for me, the same goes here along. We worked with integrated eco strategy for the materials vetting, and that's, I'm sure, is gonna continue because, obviously we haven't started construction, so some of our vetting is possibly outdated, especially with the new materials challenges that are coming out during the pandemic. So, revisiting things constantly. I encountered so many times where I had settled on a product that worked and then found out, oh, it's no longer available on the American market. So now we have to find a new strategy. So along comes the advocacy for, different materials and trying to push the boundaries. I think that what you guys did, Kelly, was like your advocacy is very, very inspiring, that you were able to have this, reaching for goals where you would actually change the market in a way, right?
Right. And that's the whole goal of any of these certification systems, right? Is that it's a framework that gets us talking to people both on our projects and outside our projects to hopefully change minds and hopefully change the way that they're doing things, because we're creating a market demand by having the certification system. So yeah,
Absolutely.
those are great success stories when they can happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can be very transformative. One thing that was brought up earlier, I think it was Kelly had mentioned about like the verification on projects. And I think that's like kind of one thing that is kind of like we should like to talk about, is the fact that like LEED is like you submit your paperwork and it's done, and it's kind of all this like predictive how you're going to use your energy and your water and that kind of thing. But like, with Living Building Challenge and WELL and with Phius, it all requires like on-site verification of different things to be able to prove the fact that you are actually meeting your targets. I just find that very interesting approach, and a way that the rating system sort of like family has like grown over time, to be able to take that into consideration as well, because you can design a building to be a certain way, but if you're not operating it, then the intent is there, but you have to be able to continue on with it.
So how does that work with WELL? I know with Living Building Challenge, there is a recertification every year for a certain amount of years, right? Is that the same with WELL, or is that a one-time kind of certification like Phius?
Yeah, so WELL is an ongoing certification. So you get your initial certification. And they've recently changed it. I believe it's like every 3 years you have to go like the full process again. But every year you do have to submit your like specific information, like for example, your air quality readings and that kind of thing, to be able to prove the fact that you're actually doing the monitoring, and like water quality readings as well as another example. So like yearly submissions of things to be able to kind of keep it up, but going through the whole process again every 3 years. But if you're keeping up with it, it shouldn't really be a major struggle to do it.
So is there a fee every time you go through that process?
Yeah, there is. There is.
So there's a recommitment every 3 years.
There is. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I believe there's like a discount after, for recertification. So,
but it's still good to like make sure that you demonstrate that you continue to follow along the guidelines, and you didn't just do it for certification and now you're changing how you're using the building, and other considerations that factored into getting the certification in the first place.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, because if you continue to have that plaque on the wall and 20 years you're not still implementing the process or whatever it is that helped you to get the certification, it's kind of would be sad to be able to keep it up there and not being able to actually prove that you're doing anything at that point in time.
Right.
So we're all a group of women presenters with diverse backgrounds, and I think it'd be nice to hear a bit about how being a woman and your backgrounds have influenced the decisions you make as an architect and the certifications that you are interested in pursuing on your projects. So Ilka, you're from Germany. How did this impact your decision to specialize in passive house certification, and in particular, low carbon passive house? And did this impact your career as a woman in the construction industry?
Yeah, good question. So yes, I grew up in Germany and I went to school in Germany. And I feel like that definitely influenced my comfort with passive house and prefabrication, because it's always been around, or not always. I mean, passive house was originally started in Germany, and when I went to school, it wasn't really taught yet, but I had heard about it, so it wasn't new to me. And I feel similarly with prefabrication and even the use of, for example, wood fiber insulation. It's something that I was already familiar with. So for me, that wasn't really a big step into the the prefabrication kind of world here. And in terms of what certification means for me as a woman, I feel like, unfortunately, there's still not a lot of representation of women on the construction site or in the construction industry in general. And a lot of times when you show up, you get sometimes undermined or not taken as seriously as your male counterparts, and that's very unfortunate. And I hope that's going to change, and I feel like it's going to change the more women are actually present all the time, so everyone gets more and more used to that. But until we're there, I do feel that certification or being consultant definitely kind of helps and gives you a tool, because you have something that kind of voice that has to be listened to if you want to meet certification. There's no other choice, really.
Yeah, that's great. You've got something to point to. I feel like you've got to meet these requirements, or yeah, good. So you also grew up in Germany. What piqued your interest in sustainability?
So I was just thinking about that because I just returned from Germany. I tripped to Germany in the summer after a long time, so I hadn't been there in a while. And what struck me really is the longevity of buildings, like my parents still live in the house they built when I was an infant. And, the attitude about, the care towards building too is different than what I've experienced here in the States. And I think that's why sustainability for me was always part of my growing up and my lifestyle. It was always there, and my parents have radiant floors, for example, in their house that they built in the 70s. And they have photovoltaics on their roof, all those things that were took a long time to catch on in the US. They were there very early on for me. So that's why it was a very normal, natural step to kind of focus on that and really make that a priority in my practice.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, one thing that struck me, once I started traveling outside of the US and understanding how different cultures, their buildings have been around so much longer, you're just wow, it's a big difference. But
yeah.
So Kelly, as you had mentioned, you had recently transitioned to a woman-owned firm. What have you noticed as a change in culture and how that impacts the design process?
It's a good question that's hard to put into words. It has been a recent change for me. I got a lot of great experience at my previous employers, and luckily always been at firms that prioritize sustainability. And so I've been able to take that with me as I've grown along the way, collecting several different credentials, kind of the alphabet soup after my name. But now that I'm with a kind of woman-led firm, and frankly, a almost all-woman firm in general, the attitudes around design are just so different and so positive and so engaging. I guess if I could wrap it up in one word, it would be empathy. It seems that empathy is being brought to the table in all conversations, whether we're talking about the design of a project, whether we're talking about the struggles within a project, as well as things that are happening in our own practice, in our own office. And so just the general vibe and attitude has completely shifted. I feel like egos have been thrown out of the room. And I want to think that that has something to do with being surrounded by very smart and powerful women. And I'm just so thrilled to finally be a part of an environment like that, because I really think to have that attitude when approaching these very complex problems that we're all dealing with in the architecture profession and really project by project, coming at it with that point of view of empathy is really the right one to get to the right solution. That's what I believe.
Wow, that's really kind of powerful, to be able to think that's the dynamic has changed so much, and I'm so glad to hear that. I'd love to follow up with you in a few years just to kind of hear how that's continuing to go.
Certainly.
So Sangeeta, what did becoming a certified passive house consultant and pursuing other sustainability certifications mean to you as a woman architect?
Thanks, Christy. That's an interesting and a bit of a loaded question. So I got my architecture degree from way back from India, and then moved to the US, to Philadelphia area after I got married. I did work for a company in Philadelphia, and after my second kid, I chose to take a break to raise a family. And before I knew it, like 12 years had gone by. And during that time, I was interested in sustainability and started pursuing sustainability credentials and certifications, like LEED, WELL, and Passive House being one of the three I had done, and then got my living building certification later. However, I definitely feel having the Passive House credential did have an impact and made a big difference in me being able to come back into like mainstream architecture practice after a 12-year gap, which, as you know, is having such big a gap is not easy in any professional career, but I definitely feel the Passive House made a big difference. The credential made a big difference. And I initially had first joined Blue Path Design. Laura Blau was generous enough to take me in. And subsequently, I'm here at WRT. So yeah, thanks for asking.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Christy, I'm curious about your background too, and what's your interest in sustainability? Because you are, I know you are at Revision and you kind of lead the sustainability practice there. So if you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure. So my background is in interior design. I practiced 10 years before in Baltimore, before I moved back up to Philly. And, you know, I was always kind of like interested in sustainability, like, but it wasn't like it was kind of more like a side project versus like part of what my life was, like where my career was. So once I moved up to Philly, after a brief stint with working at facilities department with the university, I had moved on to a construction management firm, and they were really big into LEED and sustainability and being green and touting themselves as that. And I became their sustainability manager. So it was just kind of like this, like jumping in and like learning so much I can about it, not only about like, building and constructing in a, a green and sustainable way, but also like the way their operations were running and that kind of thing. From there, I was actually introduced to Revision, and I moved over to Revision. I've been there for 11 and a half years now, and love working on sustainable projects as being part of my everyday being. It kind of gives me purpose in waking up in the morning, versus just kind of going to like a job. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. Thanks, Christy.
Oh, thank you. So that wraps up our panel discussion. We'd like to be able to open this up to the questions and answers for the audience here. And thank you very much for joining us today.